There's a truth the Vikings never said out loud, but anyone who lived in the north understood instantly the moment they stepped inside. Before they ever rode a warship, they first had to defeat a far quieter enemy. The winter storms that lasted for days, where cold winds swept into valleys like invisible blades, and 20-degree, 28-degree nights could drain the warmth out of a house in just a few hours. In a world where even good timber shrank, roof frames cracked from the cold, and water froze solid overnight, the Vikings were forced to build not a home, but a fortress against nature itself. What amazes us today isn't their strength or heroic will, but how they relied on materials that seemed ordinary: earth, grass roots, ash, straw, smoke, and the body heat of livestock, to create hidden heating systems that many modern people still don't fully understand. From the moment you step into a longhouse, you feel it immediately. They didn't survive by luck. They survived by design. And if you want to know exactly how those turf walls, heavy as small hills, and those silent heat machines kept them alive through brutal storm nights, keep watching, because this story will make you see cold in a completely different way. From a distance, a Viking longhouse looks almost like a grassy mound, so simple that many modern people might mistake it for a temporary shelter. But that simplicity was actually the strongest armor the Vikings ever built. Turf walls, massive layers of compacted earth and grass roots so dense that winter winds could barely slip through them. When crafted properly, a turf layer could block wind even better than thick wooden walls, because it didn't just stand there. It absorbed the wind's force, compressed under pressure, and dispersed it the same way a natural hill withstands a storm. Inside that heavy earth were countless interwoven roots, forming a muscular network that locked the wall onto the wooden frame, holding it together even when snow piled high and the wind screamed for nights on end. What made turf unique wasn't just its weight or thickness, but its ability to hold warmth like a natural thermal memory. During the day, it absorbed every faint scrap of heat. At night, it released that warmth slowly, keeping the interior temperature steady. Without this armor, every other heating system inside would be meaningless. And this is where you begin to understand why the Vikings saw turf walls as the first and most crucial boundary between life and the cold waiting just outside. What surprises many modern people isn't that the Vikings built their homes from earth, but how they made that earth hold heat better than some materials we use today. When a turf wall was built properly, with tightly packed damp soil, grass roots woven together like a natural mesh, and a living outer layer of grass, it worked like a giant thermal battery. During the day, even when northern sunlight was as faint as a breath, the wall absorbed every tiny scrap of warmth. At night, it released that heat slowly, preventing the longhouse from losing temperature too quickly during the hours when the wind grew most violent. But here's the twist. If the turf was packed too dry, it lost its ability to hold heat. If packed too wet, it pulled cold moisture into the house. In other words, a single mistake in the balance of soil, roots, and moisture could turn the entire longhouse into a stone-cold chamber for nights on end. This shows that the Vikings didn't build with brute force. They built with precise knowledge of soil, air, humidity, and wind, a kind of understanding many people today have never even considered. And when you stand close to the remains of a turf house, you understand why the old saying goes, "The earth keeps warmth if you know how to listen to it." If you've ever thought earthen walls were a crude technique, share your thoughts in the comments. Does a living wall that breathes slowly through winter make you rethink how modern homes are built today? If the turf wall was the armor of the longhouse, then the curved wooden frame was its spine, the structure that determined whether the house could withstand the brutal winter winds. The Vikings didn't use straight beams the way modern builders often imagine. Instead, they chose naturally curved tree trunks and branches, then joined them into arch-like ribs shaped very much like the hull of a ship. This shape created a remarkable effect. When winter winds slammed into the turf-covered roof, they couldn't push it over. The force simply slid along the curve, the same way ocean waves glide off the bow of a long ship. As a result, wind pressure dispersed evenly into the anchoring points, allowing a turf roof weighing several tons to remain stable through days of relentless snowstorms. What makes this technique even more impressive is that the Vikings had no modern measuring tools. They relied entirely on what they learned from watching the wind at sea, then transferred that knowledge directly into their architecture. They understood that even a single beam placed slightly off angle, or one curved frame lacking the right tension, could cause an entire roof to flip during a violent night storm. That's why each curved piece of timber was chosen with the same care as selecting the backbone of a warship. Look closely at this frame, and you'll see one truth clearly. The Vikings weren't just sailors. They brought the philosophy of the sea into every home they built, turning the longhouse into a ship anchored on land, strong enough to face every winter storm that tried to tear it apart. In a 28-degree-F winter, when the wind howls across the roof and the entire house depends on whatever faint warmth remains from the hearth, the thing that holds heat the longest isn't the fire. It's the straw and ash floor beneath your feet. The Vikings first spread a thick layer of straw to block the cold rising from the ground, then covered it with fine ash from the hearth. Ash naturally retains heat and repels moisture, while the straw allows the floor to breathe and stabilize warmth. Together, they turned the floor into a slow-release thermal battery, quietly storing heat and releasing it through the night. But here's the dangerous part. If the ash layer became even slightly damp or was packed incorrectly, the entire floor would turn ice cold within hours. In the middle of the night, a family could wake abruptly to the cold rising from beneath their feet, a stealthy kind of cold that's harder to notice but drains energy faster than any draft. Archaeological surveys show that floors with improperly compacted ash lost nearly twice as much heat as floors built with the correct technique. This makes the straw and ash floor far from a simple detail. It was a critical link in the longhouse's heating system. Get one layer wrong, press the wrong corner, or let melting snow dampen the ash. And the whole family paid the price before dawn. Here's something many modern people don't believe until they step inside a real longhouse. Viking smoke didn't rise cleanly into the sky. Instead, a thin layer of it was intentionally kept just below the roof, hanging like a mysterious veil. It wasn't thick enough to choke anyone, but it created an effect the Vikings understood perfectly: a natural, invisible thermal blanket. When the hearth fire weakened toward the end of the day, the rising heat didn't escape immediately. It lingered beneath that smoke layer, spreading slowly and evenly through the space below, preventing the temperature from crashing the moment the night wind turned razor cold. Northern lore says the house breathes, and this thin smoke layer was that breath. It dried the timber, kept straw and clothing from turning damp, and blocked cold drafts from slipping down through the gaps in the roof. What's fascinating is that the Vikings didn't explain this with theories or formulas. They treated it as a generational craft, something only those who understood the rhythm of the house could manage correctly. And here's the part that still surprises researchers today. This invisible heating system was so effective that if the smoke escaped too quickly, the entire house could lose its warmth dramatically in a single evening.
Welcome inside.
So the next time you think about Viking houses, imagine a thin, drifting band of smoke, quiet, steady, almost ritual-like, warming a family through a stormy winter night. And if you're impressed by how they used something most of us try to eliminate, share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, the oldest ideas contain the deepest wisdom. Among all the hidden heating systems the Vikings used, nothing is more startling than the fact that they turned their livestock into living heaters. At first, it sounds simple, but in reality, it was an extremely precise strategy. Each animal produced the equivalent heat of a small stove that stayed warm throughout the night. In Viking thinking, losing a single animal meant losing a crucial unit of heat, not just losing property. For that reason, the livestock stall wasn't built far away like in many other cultures. It was placed directly beside the longhouse, separated only by a thin wooden wall or a turf partition. The warm breath, body heat, and rising heat from the animals drifted into the living space, keeping the indoor temperature stable on those 20-degree F nights when drinking water could freeze solid in just a few hours. What makes this strategy even more dramatic is how the Vikings slept. They knew that sleeping far from the livestock wall on a freezing night was like placing yourself under the blade of the cold, because the area closest to that shared wall was always the warmest, safe zone. Sleeping spots were arranged by priority, age, health, and who needed protection most. All of this shows that a Viking heating system wasn't just one fire. It was a combination of multiple heat sources, with the livestock acting as the quiet, powerful heart of the entire system. In a Viking longhouse, wind wasn't something that drifted in by accident. It was guided, controlled, and tamed as part of the hidden heating system. The Vikings understood that a single draft entering from the wrong direction, even one so small you could barely see it, could extinguish the central fire in the middle of the night. And once the fire went out, the house lost heat so quickly that by morning everyone would be shivering. That's why they built doors extremely low, not just to keep warmth inside, but to force any incoming wind to crawl along the ground away from the fire zone. What makes this technique almost cinematic is how they oriented every vent according to the season. Winter winds were deflected by turf walls, while spring breezes were allowed to slip inside gently to reduce moisture. The Vikings didn't simply open a door, they engineered airflow, turning every small detail of the house into a natural temperature control switch. On a stormy night, when the wind is screaming across the roof, you can feel clearly that every doorway, every draft path, every angled opening was the result of generations of observation. Just a few degrees of incorrect wind direction was enough to erase all the warmth the family had fought to preserve throughout the day. If the longhouse was a heat-holding machine during the day, then at night it became a battlefield map, where every sleeping position carried life or death meaning. The Vikings didn't sleep randomly. They treated cluster sleeping, lying close together, as a calculated strategy to preserve warmth, protect the weaker members, and distribute heat efficiently. Just a few hand-widths of distance between two sleepers could scatter the shared warmth, leaving the entire group shivering in a 28-degree F night. That's why choosing where to lie, beside whom, and at what distance wasn't a habit. It was an internal political decision, reflecting each person's role and responsibility. What makes this technique so dramatic is the twist. On a truly deep, cold night, sleeping in the wrong spot could be more dangerous than walking outside in the snow. At least outdoors, you feel the cold attack you directly. Inside the longhouse, it's the silent cold, rising from the floor, seeping from the walls, or slipping into the gap between two bodies that steals heat fastest. The Vikings understood that the warmest place in the house wasn't near the hearth, but in the shared center of human body heat. Folk accounts even describe families curling into a cluster like one heart with many beats, keeping warmth balanced so no one was left on the cold edge. And that's the truth of the northern winter. Even sleep wasn't rest. It was a survival strategy in its own right. Here's something strange that anyone stepping out of a Viking longhouse in the morning can feel instantly. The cold outside hasn't weakened. You have. Not because your body hardened overnight, but because you just witnessed how the Vikings turned every tiny detail, from turf walls, drifting smoke, and straw ash floors to sleeping positions, into a unified system that worked silently like a life-preserving machine. Looking back at the 9 elements you've just seen, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The Vikings didn't survive winter through strength. They survived through system thinking. Every wall they packed, every curved beam they set, every draft they redirected, every sleeping spot they arranged. All of it was a reminder that winter doesn't defeat the weak. It defeats the unprepared. And here lies the deepest lesson. What kept them alive wasn't the fire itself, but the way they made the entire house, earth, wind, smoke, livestock, heat, work together to create a safe zone in the heart of a snowstorm. A victory not loud but unbreakable. If you ever thought ancient houses were just crude architecture, I hope this story makes you rethink the intelligence our ancestors left behind. And if one technique surprised you the most, whether it was the turf walls, the hanging smoke layer, or the cluster sleeping strategy, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring hidden survival systems, forgotten engineering, and the strange designs that helped humans endure nights as cold as 20 degrees, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.